Hello and welcome. My name is Robert Llewellyn. I am the founder and one of the presenters of the Fully Charged show of the Everything Electric show. And I'm very happy and excited to present another enlightened, innovating and entertaining episode of Almost Breaking News. Coming up, despite desperate reports to the contrary, the increase in numbers of public electric car chargers in the UK is enormous. A report showing claims of not enough minerals for all the batteries we need have been massively exaggerated. We have never, in 14 years, done a story about Cuba, but Havana is becoming a mecca for small, light electric vehicles. We have never, in 14 years, done a report about war, but Ukraine is finding a use for old, abandoned hydrogen fuel cell cars. We know about recycling batteries and solar panels. Now, scientists are starting to recycle cement. A positive story about a 125-year-old oil company. A very negative story about American oil companies way back at a time when I still had hair. But before all that, here is some actual breaking news. Now, regular viewers will be aware that we run live events all around the world. And coming up very soon is our wonderful event in Canada, Everything Electric Canada, which will be in the beautiful city of Vancouver on the 6th, 7th and 8th of September. Very, very soon. Now, I don't want to blow our own trumpet too much. Wait one moment. But we have now facilitated well over 100,000 test drives in our shows around the world since 2018. Isn't that amazing? Now, the following vehicles will be present and many will be available for test drives at the Vancouver Everything Electric show. These cars, Audi, Cadillac, Chevrolet, Ford, General Motors, Hyundai, Kia, Lexus, Mini, Mitsubishi, Nissan, Polestar, Subaru, Tesla, Toyota, VinFast, Volvo and VW. And just announced, literally, this is part of the breaking news, not the main breaking news, the part of the breaking news, Rivian will be there with some very, very exciting, shiny things to look at. Rivian. Just saying, I will say no more. But apart from Polestar in that list of cars that we have on show in Vancouver, there are, as you can see, a certain group of shiny new manufacturers who are not taking part. Yes, one country, very advanced in terms of manufacturing ability, technological innovation, and in the realm of electric vehicles, and that country is, of course, China. Yes. Just this week, the Canadian government have announced that they have decided to add 100% import tariffs on Chinese-built electric cars, effectively stopping them being sold in Canada altogether. Now, in May this year, USA did the same thing, as we well know. And more recently, the EU have announced plans to impose duties on Chinese EVs of up to 36.3%. Very specific number. I think there's various amounts depending on whether the EU consider the subsidies that the Chinese government are giving to those companies. I'm very aware that the geopolitics behind these decisions are way, way above my pay grade. I know the Chinese have been accused of using government subsidies, as I mentioned, to make their cars cheaper and therefore undermine local car makers. But I also know that a lot of legacy car makers in Europe in particular do not want these tariffs because they sell their cars they make in Europe in China. I think trade generally tends to go both ways. That's all I'm saying. And of course, we really should have local manufacturing. We should be making electric vehicles and particularly batteries all over the world in loads and loads of different countries. But we have to remind ourselves, I'm afraid we really do, we cannot ignore our history. We have to remind ourselves that governments and corporations have been happily, willingly and enthusiastically offshoring their manufacturing to China for the last 40 years. So what happens now? Oh, suddenly China gets really good at making things, and we're not making them anywhere else. And they've planned this years and years, decades in advance. Decades ago, they were planning, how can we transfer all our manufacturing from combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles? They thought about it years ago. What did we do in the West? We whined and moaned and clawed back and held back and got bribed by the fossil fuel industry. Sorry, I'm ranting really early on. But I'm just saying, I'm old enough to remember when the United States was protecting its car industries from the Germans, and then the Japanese, and then the Koreans, and of course now the Chinese. Possibly having cheaper, smaller, really technologically advanced cars entering a market might encourage competition, might encourage innovation. Just saying. That's a radical, crazy, pro-communist, crazy, liberal, tree-hugging thought. And I apologise. And here's a twist that a certain chap in the USA might get a little bit miffed. Canada's tariffs on Chinese EVs will include those made by a company called Tesla when they make their cars in the Shanghai factory. So all the Teslas available in Canada at the moment are made in Shanghai. Not anymore. So obviously the American manufacturing base can supply Teslas to Canada, but apparently they'll be a little bit more expensive. Just saying. If you're anywhere near Vancouver, please do come along. You'd be very welcome to see this possibly biggest car show we've ever done. Let's get into our first almost breaking news story. Super brief history lesson. When I drove my first electric car back in 2009, there were three public electric charge points in the UK, and two of those were ordinary domestic outlets. One was behind a gate at Mitsubishi's UK headquarters, so you had to ring in advance to get permission to charge there. That's what it was like in 2009. Now there are close to 1 million charge points available in the UK, and a new one is installed every 25 minutes, according to this Guardian article. However, the vast majority of those chargers are in people's homes and businesses. There are still only 65,779 public rapid chargers available. 65,779, is that all? Panic, literally scream and panic. Wet yourselves, sell your electric car, you will never be able to charge it. There's just no infrastructure. It's not there yet. Actually, when you consider how often the average electric car driver uses rapid chargers today, 65,780, well, a new one just come online, so it's gone up a bit. It is quite a lot of them. I use high-speed public chargers probably twice a month, and data shows that now, with over 1 million electric cars on the UK roads, a lot of public chargers are in use around 14% of every 24 hours, which means 86% of the time they are available. Now here's something that did surprise me. According to the Guardian report, Shell Recharge, yes, Shell, the oil company, is the leader in providing the most public charge points in the UK, with just under 9,000 public charging points. Now I'm being balanced. That's what I'm being balanced. Shell have got the most public chargers. Who knew? So basically, there's a lot of places you can charge your car, and the number of places increases all the time. And as a small aside, I've recently driven 1,000 miles across France, and everywhere we stopped en route, there were dozens and dozens of really high-speed chargers. This change is global, not local. Next story. I've been reading a lot about the impact of mineral extraction recently, with a wide range of views on offer. Everything we humans use or consume has to be dug up or grown. There isn't anything else. Now, if you dig up a potato, the impact is minimal. If you dig up 1 billion tons of rock, the resulting hole tends to be quite big. Very often, those processes are hidden from us, either by geographical location or because large corporations that make huge profits extracting materials from the ground like to keep things a bit discreet. If the majority of us saw the havoc, carnage, chaos and filth the oil industry leave around without a second thought every day, day in, day out, decade after decade, those oil companies might be even more unpopular than they are now. As you may have heard on our recent podcast with Sharon Wilson, the methane hunter, there are millions, literally millions of disused oil wells all over the world, and most of them are leaking methane, one of the most dangerous greenhouse gases we know. But big mining companies don't exactly have an untarnished record. See, I'm being balanced. We cannot deny, ignore, or pretend digging stuff up has no impact. Of course it has an impact. So you might ask, what's the point? Should we just keep extracting oil, refining it, and burning it once in a normal good old-fashioned, reliable, proper, real car combustion engine? Should we be doing that? However, what is becoming increasingly apparent is the massive difference between extracting hydrocarbons and extracting minerals. We consume huge amounts of energy extracting oil and gas, and we only use it once. We burn it in an engine, a cooker, a heater, a gas peaker plant, a ship, a plane. But we only burn it once. We have spent over 100 years utterly ignoring what happens to the resulting gases and particulates once we have burnt it, and it's getting increasingly expensive to carry on doing this. According to numerous reports, we need to extract close to $1 trillion worth of materials to reach a global zero-carbon energy and transport system. That is mind-bogglingly huge. Until you compare it with the fact that we extract $1 trillion worth of fossil fuel to burn every year. And then we have to extract, transport, refine, and burn another $1 trillion worth the next year. And as stated in a recent report from the Rocky Mountain Institute in the USA called the Battery Mineral Loop, once we have extracted those materials, the percentage of that material we use again will be at a currently unimaginably high level. By 2040, according to the report, and I quote, end-of-life batteries will become the new mineral ore, limiting the need for any mining altogether. We have enough to get there. Our known reserves of lithium, cobalt and nickel are twice the amount of the total demand that we may require to make this transition. And announced mining projects, so ones that have already been announced, this is where we're going to dig this stuff up, are already sufficient to meet almost all virgin demand. Now, I had to work out what virgin demand is. That is when you dig something up, you refine it, you use it the first time. After that, you recycle it. It's kind of a slightly awkward term. Anyway, moving on. We have mentioned a lot of countries around the world in one form or another on the Fully Charged Show and the Everything Electric channel. But as far as I recall, we have never mentioned Cuba. Now, if you don't know the history of Cuba, the fact that it is a communist country very near the US of A makes life complicated for Cubans. There are hundreds of very positive aspects to life in Cuba, as well as some fairly distressingly chunky negative aspects. But apart from politics, they have to import all their oil and gas. For the last 20 plus years, Venezuela has been supplying Cuba with these toxic liquids and gases. But due to global political pressure and the diminishing amounts of Venezuelan oil, exports to Cuba have shrunk dramatically. Now they have to get all their fuel from Mexico and Russia. As always, being totally reliant on external supplies is a never-ending nightmare, not to mention the vast amounts of money leaving their economy to pay for it. They have had fuel crisis after fuel crisis with long queues to buy petrol and diesel and many days when there is no gas supply for cooking. So generally speaking, life is a little bit better if you start using technology that doesn't rely on oil and gas, which is what seems to be starting to happen in Cuba. The tourist cliché of brightly painted 1950s American cars on the streets of Havana is giving way to Cuban-built electric scooters. In 2022, Cuba-based companies produced more than 23,000 electric vehicles, according to official data. What they need to do is fairly obvious: produce their own electricity using renewables and reduce fuel imports to an absolute minimum. And okay, the parts from the scooters are mostly coming from China, but they are developing new electric machinery in Cuba as well. Cuba is a sunny and windy country. They are ideally situated to benefit from being 100% renewably powered. So, all other considerations aside, it just leaves me to say, Viva Cuba. Next story. Once again, we have never, in 14 years of stories about electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cell cars and renewable energy, done a story about a war. But this little snippet really caught my eye. Now, some of you may be aware that a certain fossil fuel-funded weird dictator bloke in Russia has sent tens of thousands of young Russian men to certain death as they try to invade another country. It is ugly, brutal, and utterly stupid. The death, destruction and suffering of the Ukrainian people is unimaginable for most of us. But what we are witnessing is a terrifying new chapter in the weapons of war. Now, many of you will be aware of the impact of flying drones created by the Ukrainians, relatively cheap technology that's blowing up incredibly expensive old war machines with what seems to be remarkable ease. Well, some folks in Ukraine have been very inventive, using anything they can find and turning it into weapons. In this case, it's a war-damaged Tesla electric car and old Toyota Mirai hydrogen fuel cell cars. They strip the batteries and drivetrains out of the Tesla, remove the big hydrogen fuel tank from the Toyota, and it is big, believe me, surround it with relatively small amounts of military-grade explosives. They then use remote controls to send this ground-based device into a Russian defensive position. And this is a war. The resulting explosion was devastating. All the fears about exploding hydrogen fuel tanks were brought to vivid reality. Okay, it needed some serious plastic explosives to get it going, but clearly it really worked. It was a massive, devastating explosion. This is something I never imagined reporting on when I started this channel, but now it's happening, it's kind of obvious. This wheeled bomb not only has enormous range thanks to the Tesla batteries, it's also very quiet, and it can also travel at considerable speed. As with all technology the human race has ever developed, it can easily be adapted to use to kill people. Aren't we a lovely bunch? Next story! So we've recently covered stories about concrete that can store heat, concrete that can store electricity, and now concrete made of concrete. What the? This is a story from the good old BBC. And a warning, I'm going to use a contentious word repeatedly in this report. The word was made popular by the British film director Guy Ritchie and his adoration of Cockney gangsters. The word is slag. A team of researchers from Cambridge University's Department of Engineering have found a way to sidestep the staggering amount of emissions we produce from making cement. If global cement production was a country, it would be the third biggest source of emissions after China and the US, responsible for 7.5% of all human-made CO2. That is seriously chunky. When you make cement, you have to heat limestone to around 1,600 degrees Celsius in giant kilns that are heated by burning fossil fuel, often coal or more recently gas. This removes carbon dioxide from the limestone, leaving you with cement. Now, the Romans did it over 2,000 years ago. It is seriously well old. But of course, all the emissions from burning the fuel and the CO2 released by the actual process, where do they go? Where do all those emissions go? Up, up, up and away, gone, all gone, bye-bye. Don't think about it, carry on, stop, no, shush, carry on, keep going, no problem, yeah, off they go. So what these clever folks from Cambridge have done is observe how the latest electrically powered steel furnaces operate. Yes, these are massive, high-temperature, molten steel furnaces that only use electricity, which means you can, doesn't mean you will, but you can produce the electricity in a zero-carbon manner. When you recycle steel, you add chemicals that float on the surface of the molten metal to prevent it reacting with the air and creating impurities in the steel. This floating material is known as slag. The Cambridge team noticed that the composition of used cement is almost exactly the same as the slag used in the electric arc furnaces. So you tip the used cement onto the seething vat of molten steel and sizzle, 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 you end up with high-grade Portland cement. And you don't have to burn any fuel to achieve this. You just need a metric ton of renewable generated electricity, which we now know is kind of easy to sort out. So it's possible. I'm not saying it's a total guaranteed solution, but it's possible for more and more heavy industrial processes we all rely on to be very near zero carbon and much more reliable, as we don't have to pay vast sums to dodgy people around the world to secure imports of toxic fossil fuel. Isn't that lovely? Next story. Now, this is a very positive story about a very old oil company, Castrol, which was founded in 1899. Now, I'm sure we've all heard of them, but they don't sell fuel, they sell lubricants, which are kind of critical for all machinery. It doesn't really matter what it is. They have launched a series of lubricants under the name On EV Fluids. This is lubricants for transmission and thermal fluids for new electric vehicles. They've also announced a $60 million investment in a new state-of-the-art electric vehicle battery testing centre and analytical laboratory in the UK. All very positive, but a bit of balance here. Castrol are owned by BP, who have shown themselves to be a little bit greenwashy every now and then. Beyond petrol, remember that? But it's interesting to note that a big company entirely connected with the internal combustion engine is seriously thinking about the approaching end of that technology. Next story. And another bit of balance. In a report cited in an article in the UK's Guardian newspaper, we now have very solid confirmation that the oil industry as a whole, and the American Petroleum Institute in particular, knew in incredible detail the damage the ever-increasing burning of fossil fuel would have on our environment. And we're not talking last year or in the noughties. We're talking 50 plus years ago. Yes, that was when I had a lot of hair growing out of my head. This is when numerous oil and refining companies funded research into the long-term effects of burning their product, the results of which were kept from the general public for decades. Basically, they knew. The scientists they employed predicted what is happening now with startling accuracy. They were in the 1970s. They worked out what was going to happen, and they're so close to exactly what's happening now. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the methane, the temperature changes, the storms, everything. They predicted it. I was listening to David Bowie and Led Zeppelin while they were working that out. The oil companies did literally nothing about it except lie and deny and crush any opposition. As always, links to all these stories are in the show notes. Next story. Well, I've got one more quick story. It's also very good news. A report has just been released by a European think tank called EMBA, which shows beyond any argument that for the first 6 months of this year in the European Union, wind and solar generated more electricity than fossil fuels. That is historic enough, especially when you consider that Poland and Hungary, traditionally seen as coal-powered countries, are now generating a really significant percentage of their electricity from renewables. But this shift is worldwide, and the percentage of renewables is only going to grow larger. And this is a quote from the report. Renewables generated a record 30% of global electricity in 2023, driven by growth in solar and wind. With record construction of solar and wind in 2023, a new era of falling fossil generation is imminent. 2023 was likely the pivot point, marking peak emissions in the power sector. That is extraordinary. Even 10 years ago, the global production of renewable electricity was in the 4s or 5%, and it's now 30. So when we focus on electric ground transport and the impact it has on the oil industry, it's really minimal. around 1% reduction in global fuel sales. I mean, that is billions of gallons of toxic hydrocarbons not being burnt every year, but it's still a tiny slice. Power generation, on the other hand, we're talking billions of tons of coal every year, trillions of cubic meters of gas not being burned, and making massive eye-watering profits for various companies and countries. And I'll say it once again, that is money leaving our economies if we're not oil and gas producing countries. That's enough. I'm getting contentious again. Nurse, bring me my pills. I'm going to slip into the suit with the very, very long sleeves. That is all from this episode of Almost Breaking News. As always, if you have been, thank you for watching.